We encourage you to open your Bible or to follow the reading on our screens from the 20th chapter of John, beginning with the 19th verse. This is a story that is familiar with many of you, the story of, we refer to it as the story of doubting Thomas. When it was evening on that day, the first day of the week, and the doors of the house where the disciples had met were locked for fear of the Jews. Let me put this in context. The crucifixion has taken place. The resurrection has taken place. But the disciples do not really understand what has happened. They're not celebrating Easter. This is not a time of joy or celebration for them. They are scared to death. They've gone into a room, probably the same upper room where they experienced the Last Supper with Jesus. And they have locked the doors. John says for fear of the Jews, probably for fear of the Jews and the Romans. They're scared to death. So that's where they are. They don't really understand what's happening yet. Jesus came and stood among them, and he said, "Peace be with you." After he said this, he showed them his hands and his side. Then the disciples rejoiced when they saw the Lord. And Jesus said to them again, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, so I send to you." When he had said this, he breathed on them and said to them, "Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive the sins of any, they are forgiven them. If you retain the sins of any, they are retained." But Thomas, who was called the twin, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the mark of the nails in his hands, and put my finger in the mark of the nails, and my hand in his side, I will not believe." A week later, the disciples were again in the house, and this time Thomas was with them. Although the doors were shut, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, notice he came back just for Thomas. I wonder if he's ever come back just for you. Maybe. He came back for Thomas. He said to Thomas, "Put your finger here and see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it in my side. Do not doubt, but believe." And Thomas answered him, "My Lord and my God." And Jesus said to him, "Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed," now hear this last sentence, "blessed are those who have not seen and yet have come to believe." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. I want to share something with you this morning that I think a lot of preachers are reluctant to admit. And that is that there is a difference between what we know and what we believe. There is a difference between knowledge and faith. It would be so easy, so great if we could just stand up here on Sunday mornings and say, this is the way it is. That would just be a matter of fact, that there would be something about which there is no dispute and about which we could have no doubts whatsoever. But the truth of the matter is that faith and knowledge are not the same thing. What we know and what we believe are two very different things. And I can illustrate that very, very simply. If you look up here at me this morning, unless you have trouble seeing, and some of you do, but if you look up here this morning, if you hear me say that I'm standing before you preaching in a black robe, you don't need any kind of faith in order to believe that. You can look up here, your eyes will tell you that that's a matter of fact. It's knowledge. I'm standing before you in a black robe. That is knowledge. But if I say to you that I will be standing up here 1 year from now preaching to you in a black robe, that is a matter of faith. Now, the truth of the matter is, I hope that I'll be standing up here 1 year from now preaching in a black robe. But you just have to trust me when I say that to you, wouldn't you? And if I were to say to you that I will be preaching to you 10 years from now in a black robe, you'd say, I don't think that black robe's going to last that long, wouldn't you? It would take a lot of trust, wouldn't it? A lot of faith. There's a difference between what we believe and what we know. No one understood that more than Jesus. When we open this very, very rich story about doubting Thomas, only John tells us this story. It's such a wonderful story. We find that the 10 disciples, remember Judas Iscariot has already killed himself. Thomas, the one called the Doubting Thomas, is not there. And so 10 of the disciples are in this room. We just talked about this. They're scared to death. The door is locked. It's sometime after the crucifixion and after the resurrection, so 3 days have passed, and suddenly Jesus stands amongst them. And they have an opportunity to confirm with their senses that he is in fact risen. They were able to see him. They were able to touch the mark in his side, touch the nail prints in his hands, and they see that he is resurrected. And because of that, they know he is risen. When Thomas gets back, they are so excited. They start sharing the good news with Thomas. They say, guess what? Jesus is risen. And they're surely disappointed because Thomas doesn't believe them. But Thomas has a reason for not believing them. He says, look, you all have knowledge. You've seen him, you've touched him, and you expect me to go on faith. He understands there's a difference between knowledge and faith. And Thomas refuses. He says, unless I see him with my own eyes, unless I touch him with my own hands, I will not believe. And Jesus comes back a few days later. It says a week later, they're in the same room, and Jesus comes back. Now all 11 are there, and Jesus comes back. And Thomas has the extraordinary opportunity to see Jesus and to touch him with his own hands. And this remarkable phrase from Jesus, he says, you believe in me because you have seen me and touched me. How blessed are those who will not be able to see me or touch me, but who will believe in me anyway. He said that for you and me, didn't he? He was thinking about you and me because he would know that you and I would never have the opportunity to see and touch him. He knew that you and I, like Thomas, would struggle with our doubts because there's a difference between faith and knowledge. It can be tough, can't it, if you have doubts? I wonder if you've ever had the experience of standing around the water cooler, maybe around the season of Easter, and everybody's talking about the resurrection with such great certitude. Or maybe you're in a Sunday school class and everybody's talking about the resurrection and nobody's expressing any doubt whatsoever. Who's going to be brave enough to do that? I've always appreciated Thomas for this reason, because Thomas kind of gives us a little permission. But most of the time, when everybody else is talking about the resurrection as if they have no doubts whatsoever, most of us are afraid to admit that maybe there's some doubt there. But for most people, doubt is a part of the faith journey. After all, you have to have some faith just to believe that I might be here 1 year from now. Faith and knowledge are two different things. I appreciate the courage of Thomas to say, I have doubts, and it was his doubts that took him further on his journey of faith. A couple of weeks ago, a young woman called me and said, I want to come by and visit with you if it's okay. I said, of course. She came by and we spent quite a bit of time together. Her story is a horrible story. She's in her late 30s. She's probably dying. She's been battling a terrible tumor for a long time, and she has a new prognosis, and it is not good. I pray for her every day. I think she might make it. She's got a new protocol that she's on, a new chemotherapy that she's taking. I think she might make it. I pray that she does. But the prognosis is terrible. And she sat in my office with me and she said, I just needed to talk to you because I'm scared. For the first time, I'm really, really scared. And I said, well, it's normal for people to be scared. Anybody going through what you're going through would be scared. And she said, yes, I know that. But she said, but I'm scared for another reason. She said, I'm scared because I've been a Christian all of my life, but now facing my own mortality, I have doubts. I have severe doubts that haunt me, and I'm scared that God's going to punish me. You know what I said to her? I said, that's ridiculous. I said, that's ridiculous. The God who created you and loved you, the God who has loved you all through these 39 years, the God who has sustained you throughout this illness, the God who will sustain you to the very end, the God who will love you through this life into the next life, will never, ever punish you because you have doubts. Let me tell you something. That young woman virtually danced out of my office. Here she is facing her mortality. I didn't say anything at all to change that. I just told her it was okay to have doubts and God wasn't going to hold it against her. And she virtually danced out of my office. And she was so strong and clear in her faith. She was embracing her doubts and she was moving forward with God and with her own life. I called her 2 nights ago. I said, look, I'm going to preach on Sunday. I'd like to share your story. I said, nobody's going to know who I'm talking about. I'm not going to use your name. But it's such a personal and powerful story. I'd like to share your story if you don't mind. You know what she said? She said, of course. She said, if my story can help anybody else that's struggling with doubt, of course, I want them to be helped. Isn't it amazing? Let me tell you the good news about this. When we embrace our doubts as a part of our spiritual journey, here's the good news about it. It's not a secondhand journey, and the reason is this. What we believe is much, much more important and powerful than what we know. I have to tell you, I have spent most of my life not understanding that. And a few years ago, it suddenly occurred to me that what we believe is more powerful than what we know because it changes our lives. And it's just a tremendously life-changing insight. The things that you know are not nearly as important as the things that you believe with the very depth of your being. In the 1970s, the early 1970s, I had the great privilege of working for one of the great preachers in Methodism, Dr. Robert E. Goodrich Jr. He later became a bishop, Bishop Robert E. Goodrich Jr. He was a great, great preacher. Back in the 50s and 60s and even in the early 70s, they had a lot of revivals in Methodism back then. He was a very popular revival preacher. And I remember hearing him tell one time about a revival that he did in a little Texas town. If you've ever been to a Methodist church or a Baptist church for that matter in a little Texas town, you know that most of these churches are built exactly the same. Big red brick buildings with big front porches, you know, all these stairs that go up on the front porch. And he had been in this little town, they preached a revival, and it was in the summertime, and after the service that evening, they had all come out on the front porch, and it was a cool evening. They were standing around talking, just fellowshipping. And there was a group of kids playing up there on the front porch. And a little boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, playing there, jumped off, maybe 8 or 9 feet, jumped off of the porch onto the ground. And for some reason, there was some clutter, some trash down there. And there was a 2x4 on the ground with a 16-penny nail sticking straight up. And Dr. Goodrich said that he was standing there and he saw this happen. This child jumped off and he hit that 2x4, and that 16-penny nail went through the sole of his shoe, through his foot, and up through the top of the shoe, sticking out. And he said the boy was hysterical. He was in such pain, screaming and crying, they could do nothing with him. The parents gathered around, everybody gathered around. They couldn't get close to him. They wanted to try to pull the board and the nail out. They could not do that. Finally, they gathered him up. They took him to the hospital, to the emergency room. When they got him to the emergency room, the doctors and nurses couldn't do anything with him either. They were trying to pull the board and the nail out. They couldn't do that. They wanted to try to take the shoe off. They couldn't do that. Finally, they resorted to cutting the shoe off of his foot because that's all they could do. When they finally cut the shoe off of his foot and pulled the sock off, they discovered that the nail had gone between 2 of his toes. And there was not even a scratch. And when they showed it to this boy, he still could not stop crying. He was in absolute agony. And it took them 15 or 20 minutes just to get him calmed down. And Dr. Goodrich said, I promise you, when we left the emergency room, I promise you, he limped as we... I promise you, what you believe is so much more important than what you know, because it will shape your life. How you live it, what you do, whether you decide to live a life of love or a life of hate, whether you decide to forgive or not, whether you are a coward or a hero, whether you're a person of honor or not, whether you are resilient or whether you crumble at the smallest thing, what you believe will determine who you are and how you live your life. And what you know is nothing compared to what you believe. Hal Warner's a member of our choir. He sent me this notice the other day. Stephen Hawking was in California the other day, Caltech. You know Stephen Hawking, the great theoretical physicist. I saw Stephen Hawking in person a few years ago. A friend of mine was a vice president at EDS. A VIP, felt so fortunate, invited me to a VIP deal out at EDS, a very small auditorium. I was sitting as close to him as you all in the front row here. I don't guess it's quite the same as meeting Einstein, but it was pretty cool, I thought, you know. And he was out at Caltech, and he was doing, he's moved from being an agnostic to being an atheist. And they paid $1,000 a ticket to hear him. And the name of his speech was The Origin of the Universe. And the primary message was, we didn't need a creator to create the universe. And so this is what he said. This is what we know. He said, we now believe that the universe is 13.8 billion years old, that it was created in the fraction of a second, and that there was no need at all for a God or a creator. I followed up on some of this. I went online to see how big the universe is. This is pretty good consensus here now. They now believe that what they call the visible universe is 28 billion light years in diameter. But that's what they call the visible universe. I can't even begin to comprehend this. But they're now saying that if you were living on the edge of that visible universe, that there might be infinite space beyond that. And that, and now theoretical physicists are postulating that there might be multiple universes, and maybe even an infinite number of multiple universes beyond this one. That's what we think we know. In his speech, Hawking made reference to one of the popes who said, I beg our Roman Catholic scientists not to study the moment of creation because it isn't faithful. I say just the opposite. I beg them to study the moment of creation because every time they do, they tell me about a God that's so much bigger than we ever dreamed. But that's what we think we know in this moment of time. Let me tell you what we don't know. Let me tell you what it doesn't explain. It doesn't explain the soldier in Afghanistan who throws himself on a grenade to save his brothers because he believes in the power of love. It doesn't explain the alcoholic who has not had a drink for 30 years. Because once he got to step 2 out of step 12, the one about the higher power, once he gave himself to the higher power, it was all over. He was rescued from a life of absolute chaos. And from that point on, his life had power and meaning. It doesn't tell us about the soprano who stands to sing Handel's "I Know That My Redeemer Liveth." And as she sings, the tears pour down her cheeks because she has met that Redeemer and he has changed her life. It doesn't explain the veterinarian in our church who every time he euthanizes a dog, he kisses it on the cheek, on the nose, and says, "Save a place for us." It doesn't explain the fact that you know. It doesn't explain what you know deep in your heart, that there is more to life than meets the eye. That somehow you know when you look at your child in the cradle, or when you look at your wife, or when you look at your own hands and you consider the mystery of the gift of life itself. It does not explain that you know that life is a gift from someone greater than you. I say, embrace your doubts, because what you believe is so much greater than anything you know.